we've written our papers now. Now we want to get them published. But we also want to think a little bit about, like, why do we talk about publications in the first place? Why are you here?
Publish.
You're here to publish. And why do you have to publish? To get promoted. So we forget about that whole communication thing a little bit, and there is definitely a like self-serving career aspect to this. So this is what happens when you don't publish. You might perish.
No pressure.
No pressure, though. So the first part of this talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about expectations, kinds of papers, that sort of thing a little bit. And then we'll talk more about the editorial process and how it works. So the first thing is you have to understand the expectations in your own environment. And if you haven't had that conversation with like your division chief or your chair, at some point you need to have that conversation. So, oops, got ahead of myself. That means that you have to understand like what your department expects, what your school expects, what is expected for future jobs, for promotion, etc. And that may be in terms of the number, it may be in terms of the quality, it may be in terms of like first authorships, senior authorships, or last authorships, co-authorships. All of that needs to be sort of understood. And I strongly encourage you to get that information to make it easier on yourself so you know what your sort of target and expectations are. In terms of expectations, different groups use different things. Sometimes it's sheerly the number of papers, which is sadly not the best measure. It's a inherently wrong measure in many ways because it rewards just getting it published. And that leads to bad papers and not much communication. It might be the number of papers in higher impact journals. We're going to talk about the impact factor and what that means. Might be the mean number of citations. Why are citations important? Say that again?
For more dissemination.
Yeah, it means it's been disseminated. It also means from a metric of you that people are paying attention to you, right? The H index, the M index, and the I-10 index I'm going to explain in just a second. So the H index is a individual measure of productivity and impact of a scientist and or a scholar. And it means that you have had H papers cited at least H times. So it looks something like this, where you have on the x-axis there the paper number, like how many papers you've had. On the y-axis is the number of citations. So if you've had 10 papers, like if you've written 100 papers, but most of them haven't been cited very much, you might have an H index of 10, where 10 of them had been cited at least 10 times. That encourages you to get your paper cited, right? So it means that, and actually when you calculate the H index, you can't count the ones of citing yourself. It's not incorporated into the H index. So you need other people to pay attention. You might have circumstances where you have a lot of papers being cited often, that's on the right here, or a few highly cited papers. It's a decent measure, but what do you think happens with your H index over time? It can only go one direction. Goes up. The older you are, the higher your H index, generally speaking, because you've had longer time for people to find your papers and cite them. And once you're cited, it can't go back, so it can only go forward. So it's not really a fair comparison between like a full professor that's been around forever and someone that's a new assistant professor, right? So that's where the M index comes in, which doesn't get used that often, but has one big advantage. Like the big advantage is it takes into account how long the person has been publishing. Sadly for me, personally, it really hurts me because I had one publication in college, and then I went on to like medical school, graduate school. Took me a long time for that second one. A good probably, how long? 13 years between paper 1 and paper 2. Not so good. The I-10 index is used by Google Scholar. I kind of like this one. It's a number of publications that have been cited at least 10 times. So one of the things about understanding these measures for yourself, so if you you can find yourself in Google Scholar, make sure that it's actually you. William C. Miller, there's more than one, turns out, as you might imagine. One of whom is fairly prolific in the field of sort of rehabilitation medicine. And so it's easy to tell that was him, not me, but I have to go through and make sure they didn't give his papers to me. In any case, like, you can go into Google Scholar, look at this, and one reason for knowing these different indices is when you're talking to your, like, let's say you pride yourself on doing really good work, which I hope you do, not being prolific. You can use these to help make your case that, look, my work is important. People are citing it. People are paying attention, and my I-10 index is pretty good. And you can even search on other colleagues from other institutions or whatever and say, you've heard of this person? Well, my I-10 index is basically the same as theirs. So another thing to think about is what kinds of papers and why. So obviously, journal research articles are sort of what we're mostly talking about. There are also papers that you publish in a supplement as opposed to a regular issue. We'll talk briefly about that. There's systematic reviews, which really get counted as a regular research paper. Narrative reviews, which do not get counted as a regular research paper. Now, does everyone know the difference between a systematic review and a narrative review? Okay, so a systematic review means that you have an official, like, written protocol for how you're going to extract the data from the published literature. So you have a standard search terms. Ideally, you work with a librarian to work those out. You get a long list of papers. You go through them all. You decide which ones are relevant. You extract data. You write the paper. You might even do a meta-analysis, which is a numerical summary. A narrative review is like, hey, Bill, you want to write a review of I don't know, what can I write a review on anymore? Something. And it's just my opinion. And I'm like saying, oh, this paper is really important. This one's not so much. On your CV, generally those go in different parts. The systematic review counts as a regular paper. The narrative review counts as a review. Methods papers, thought pieces. What do I mean by a thought piece? Any ideas? They're kind of like a reflection. They're usually something about moving the field forward. So they're very close to a commentary, but they tend to be a little more methodsy in a way, like there's some issue that you're trying to address. But they fall really close to that editorial commentary space. Then book chapters and books. Anyone written a book? That's good. And then there are abstracts. All right. So in general, when you have a regular research paper, the RCT is going to be the sort of most valued, but that's sort of arbitrary. In general, though, we'll agree, I think, that a case series is probably going to be less valuable than doing a RCT or a good, strong cohort study. So I mentioned supplement papers in a supplement before. Has anyone ever published a paper in a supplement? Okay, so what happens with a supplement is usually a supplement is based on a meeting or some sort of workshop or a special call. And in those cases, it's like for a conference, say, everyone, they have agreed that they're going to publish a special supplement from this workshop. And then everyone there has the opportunity to write a paper, and it will be peer reviewed, but acceptance is almost always guaranteed. So on your CV, you can always tell if something was published in a supplement because it will have a little S next to the issue number, and often actually next to the page numbers as well. So when, like, your boss is looking at it, they'll know it was in a supplement, not in a regular issue. And there's it's devalued a little bit to have been in a supplement because it's easier to get it in. So you have to decide, is it worth being part of that issue with all those other papers? Or should I just take my chances and publish it elsewhere?
Would clinical practice guidelines be considered a supplement, or where would that fall?
So clinical practice guidelines could essentially be kind of like a supplement. They're a little bit of a special realm in and of themselves, that I didn't have on my list. If you're publishing in clinical practice guidelines, like with other people that help develop them, there's a bonus there in terms of how that's going to be interpreted that would be bigger than a supplement, in the sense that you have been tagged to help develop these guidelines. That means that someone noticed you and someone thought you were smart enough to contribute. And so if I were your chair, I would be saying, like, cool, that's great. Now don't spend too much time doing that, but I love the fact that they brought you in. No, that's just an abstract. We'll talk about that in just a couple minutes. That's a whole nother smaller bucket. But sometimes conferences will select people that have written abstracts and pull them and ask them to write a paper for a supplement. So it wouldn't be everybody, it would be a selected group. And when we talked about narrative or systematic reviews. Should you write that book chapter? So some, old person from your department sends you an email, says, I've been writing this book chapter for the last 45 years, and, I need some help. Would you write this book chapter with me? I see two heads shaking in the appropriate direction. I'd like to see the whole room shaking in the appropriate direction. Usually the answer is no. Run as far away as you can. Unless, because they're just not worth the time and energy. Like, no one reads books, especially now, right? So they just aren't worth your time and energy. But there are times when they, I say this lightly, could be worth it. And those are when the book is like the most important one in your field. If you're the person that wrote the chapter on something in Harrison's Internal Medicine, probably that's a good sign, right? Like, oh, you're important. Is Harrison's even around anymore? I don't know. Or Cecil's. The second time is when the person asking you is absolutely critical for you. So if it happens to be like your division chief asking you to do this, then this is what you do. If it's your division chief asking you to write this book chapter, you go into their office, you make an appointment. You go into their office and you say, you want me to write this book chapter. First you email back saying, can we talk about it? And then you ask them, can I meet with you to talk about it? You go into their office and you say, why do you want me to write this book chapter? And they'll give you some answer. You say, okay, as one of my mentors, is this a good idea for me? And I want you to put on your mentor hat right now and tell me why this is a good idea. And then it's sort of like, as the editor of this book, because that's probably why they're asking you, they're one of the editors, like, is it a good idea for me to do it? And as my mentor, is it a good idea for me to do it? And in general, whenever you're dealing with your division chief or department chair, always ask them, are they talking to you as their division chief, as your division chief, or as your mentor? Because the answers are often different. And when you can get them to talk to you as their mentor, they'll tell you, okay, forget it, and they'll find someone else. But if they come back and say, I really need you to do it, then you're sort of stuck. The only other time to do this is when doing that lit review for it is going to be extremely valuable. Like you're moving into a new space and you really need to know, then go ahead and do the book chapter. All right. Thought pieces and methods papers and editorials and commentaries can actually be really, really useful. They're short, they're usually relatively quick, and what they do is make a name for you. Like you become associated with this field. And remarkably, even though they're short, they're often relatively highly cited. Mostly because you've digested something in a meaningful way. So I'm going to give you an example. So when I was a RWJ clinical scholar, I was here and I had a part-time gig with FHI, Family Health International at that point, which is now FHI 360. I literally had an office in a broom closet. That's why the broom closet's there. I had a desk that was about 3 feet by, 15 inches with brooms behind me and all around me. And Ward Cates, who was the president at the time and was a well-known person in sort of reproductive health and STIs and that sort of thing, was the president there at the time. He sort of knocked on the broom closet door, barged in and said, what do you think about this paper that he threw on my desk? And I read the paper and it was like really a biostatistician writing about this problem in my field about how new tests, diagnostic tests were being evaluated. And I was like, no one is going to understand this paper. I understood it because I'm sort of trained to understand it, but most people are not going to understand this. So I decided, and that's the paper up there, discrepancy and discrepant analysis. It was in the Lancet. It should have been, like a little better edited than it was. And so I decided I would translate that as a thought piece into a new, into English. So I translated that paper, and this is what happened. So from writing that little paper, I was offered, I went to the CDC to give a workshop because they were talking about this issue. I was asked by the FDA to give statements. I was asked to be part of AdHealth, which is the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health, to be their, quote, diagnostic test expert, which then led to a JAMA paper. I was asked to be part of another project from RTI, which then led to a different JAMA paper, all because I took the time to think that this was important and it needed to be done. So you never quite know what's going to happen. And probably the sort of most extreme part of this was, so Julie Schachter, at the time that I published this paper, he was a microbiologist who actually used the method that we were critiquing. Like that other guy that wrote that first paper, they had a big shouting match at a conference one time. I had no idea that that had happened. So I wrote this paper completely naively, and a few months later, Clinical Infectious Diseases says, we want you to write an editorial much like what you wrote before, but we're going to give the other side a chance to respond. And they chose Julie Schachter. Julie Schachter at the time was the editor-in-chief of Sexually Transmitted Diseases, the journal I am now the editor-in-chief for. I was like first-year assistant professor. He was like 29th billionth year full professor. And also just like this huge imposing figure that made you feel really small no matter what you said. So I was like, this is terrible for my career. This is going to be a big mistake. But I wrote it anyway, and he wrote his. And afterwards he was like, you know, I understand everything you're saying, but realistically this is the problem and this is why we do this. And I said, I know, that's why you do it, but there are other ways you could do it, and you could do it a little bit better. And we had this like real actual conversation. Fast forward 15 years, he's retiring. He says, Bill, do you want to be the editor of STD? So how you write it makes a big difference, but taking the chance to write it is a huge, huge part of that. Beware of having too many abstracts, so going to lots of conferences and just having an abstract in every conference, because if you don't finish those and make them into papers, it looks like you don't finish projects. So you need to balance that visibility of going to the conference, having the abstract, and you have to have the final product as well. So generally avoid submitting an abstract simply to go to a conference. Just go to the conference unless there's some reason you have to have an abstract to attend that particular meeting. And make your abstracts count. Turn them into papers. So the impact factor, how many of you feel really comfortable with what an impact factor is? How many of you have heard about an impact factor? Pretty much everyone, right? So impact factors can be one consideration for where you publish. I would not make them high on the list because there are other ways that journals impact things. So, but what they are is a simple calculation of the impact factor for 2023 is the citations in the full year of 2023 divided by the publications of that journal in 2022 and 2021. So all the publications that were eligible to be cited is the denominator, and the number of citations is in the numerator. And the 5-year impact factor just extends back further. So you're looking for citations in that first 1 to 2 years after publication. Here's a list. So like Lancet is 169, JAMA 120, New England Journal 159. I'm an epidemiologist, so I listed the epi journals there. They're a lot smaller, right? Like that's much more typical. And STDs is right around 3, which is pretty good for a specialty journal in a field like that. You can go beyond the impact factor to things like article influence score and eigenfactor score, and then the normalized eigenfactor. These are useful measures. Essentially, they're giving you a measure of how relative to the average journal, how good is this journal. So it's often like if the score is above 1, they're better than an average journal. If it's below 1, it's less so. So like when you get to the normalized eigenfactor, if you, an average journal is 1, if it has a value of 5, that means it's 5 times an average journal. So we talked earlier about matching your work to the journal and understanding the journal's personality, talking to the people that know journals. And I mentioned jane.biosemantics.org, and this is what Jane looks like. The box to the left, you can just cut and paste your abstract into that space. And then you click on Find Journals at the bottom, and it will give you a list of journals from best fit to lesser fits with information about, like, does it put things into PubMed C for you or not? Is it open access? Is it Medline indexed or not? So you almost never want to publish in something that's not indexed in Medline. That's not a good idea. And we're going to talk about open access or not in a moment. But I found it pretty useful, at least when you look at like the first top 4 or 5. It tends to give you a sense. So traditional publication was largely based on either societies. So many of your professional societies have a journal. Those journals, if you're are typically free to you as a member. They aren't really free because you paid your membership. And other people can access them who aren't members through libraries. And libraries pay the subscription fees. But it doesn't cost the author anything to publish. Like you just write it and send it in, and might cost you, you know, if you want color figures or something, there might be a fee. But generally it's free. Most of these journals now put them in PubMed. It becomes free to everyone at 1 year, or PubMed-C. In contrast, the open access model says everyone should have access to this work, but we'll make the authors pay for it. Seems on the one hand like a great idea, on the other hand it's a problem, which is you have to have money to pay for it. The other problem is it leads to gaming of the system by unscrupulous, is that a word? Unscrupulous people. So many open access journals are really good, like PLOS. Anything that has PLOS in front, feel free to publish there. Anything that has BMC in front of it, great. But beware of predatory open access journals. They have a minimal review process. Their goal is not science, their goal is profit. And often they will use similar names to major journals. So I'll give you 2 examples. So there's a one that's called Epidemiology, open access. There's also one called Sexually Transmitted Diseases, open access. And I have had, this hasn't happened for a while, but I've had letters from people who said, here's the review that you asked for. What do you think? And I'm like, I didn't ask you for a review. And they said, well, here's your letter. And it would be a letter that said sexually transmitted diseases with no open access, just sexually transmitted diseases open access would like you to do this. And somewhere like in the, somewhere they would actually say their real name, but not anywhere obvious. And it wouldn't be signed by me, it would be signed by someone that they wouldn't recognize, like, quote, managing editor asking for it. I don't have data beyond 2014 because this list doesn't exist in this way anymore, but Beals was a librarian who started tracking the number of predatory publishers, and it was just an exponential increase once this phenomenon started. Just take a moment to read the name of this journal, the Journal of Infectious and Non-Infectious Diseases. That would be everything, as best I can tell. Anytime you read, first of all, nearly always, unless you recognize, like truly recognize the journal or the editor, if they're soliciting from you, it's predatory. If there are exclamation points anywhere in it, it is predatory. If it says greetings of the day, it is predatory. Herald Scholarly has been trying to become less predatory, I think, but they're still pretty much predatory. They're really fast. So this is from a doctoral student at Ohio State. It begins, "May you enjoy a bountiful Thanksgiving Day." His article was published on November 21st. That was received on November 25th. Like 4 days from publication to being asked for, "Do you have any more?" Conferences are predatory too. This one took a whole week before he was asked to present at a conference. So just be cautious. I had a PhD student once who had written a beautiful thought piece, actually, that was part of her dissertation. Really well done. She had tried to publish it. Thought pieces can be hard to publish. I didn't mention that thing before, because you have to find the right journal. They have to be open to sort of commentaries by random people, that sort of thing. She had tried twice to get it published, and she had just gotten her rejection back. And she got one of these, didn't ask me, and sent it off. And before I could intervene, it had been accepted essentially within 48 hours. And once it's been accepted, you're lost. Like, that paper is lost to you forever in terms of other journals. So it's never shown up in PubMed, and it has no options other than people randomly discovering this journal and finding that paper. And I don't even know if the journal exists online anymore. So pay attention to the warning signs of fake journals, the website, the name I mentioned before, the review process. If they don't tell you how it's going to be reviewed, if they have very short, no quality journal can turn around a review in less than a week. Really less than 3 weeks, generally speaking. There should be information about the ownership, management, that sort of thing on their website. There should be some form of editorial board. One of the things that you can tell is sometimes it will be an infectious diseases journal, and you look at the editorial board on the website, and it's got like an orthopedic surgeon and an anesthesiologist, and like, why are they there for an infectious diseases journal? You will get, in addition to being asked to send your papers there, you will get random editorial board invitations. If you don't recognize the journal, always say no.
But there is also a problem that I see sometimes the editor really exists, and they are just working together with their friends to publish in that specific journal without even reviewing the papers. They just get together, a group of friends, and they keep publishing together.
Yeah, there's that too. All right. There should be some process for misconduct. Something about publishing ethics. They should belong to, now I'm blanking on the name of the organization. It's got 4 letters in it. Something about, it'll come to me in about 10 minutes, and then I'll tell you what it was. They should actually, this isn't always true anymore, because many journals that are purely online, which are valid journals, don't necessarily have issues. They may just publish when they're received, but most journals still have an issue. And it should be very clear how you access, how they're archived, what their sort of revenue source is, and what their advertising policy is, and the fact that they do this direct marketing to try and get you to publish things. So another way to avoid predatory journals is through this website, Think, Check, Submit. It's actually pretty helpful. It gives you guidance as to things you can do to avoid making a mistake. All right, so once we've written the paper, sometimes we have trouble actually letting it go. And one of the reasons that we're afraid of being rejected, another thing is sometimes we're not very confident in how well it's been written. Sometimes it's just time consuming. And sometimes we have this need for perfection, which we'll talk a lot about this afternoon, but don't let perfectionism interfere. The perfect is the enemy of the good. And our goal is good enough. Like, we want a paper that's good enough. People will get the message. If you try to make everything perfect, you won't get anywhere because nothing is ever actually perfect. Uh-huh.
Where does sort of responding to co-authors edits, like particularly when co-authors are editing each other back and forth, like how do you sort of, that seems like a barrier.
That is a barrier that we're going to talk about in a little bit.
Okay.
And so your goal here is good enough. To maximize your publication success, define your research question, tell a clear and compelling story, determine authorship early, meaning like figure out who the group is that's going to be the authors. Ideally, before the study even starts, you should have an idea of who the authors are going to be. Choose your audience and journal carefully, like we were talking about. Follow the journal's rules. Understand the publication process, which we're going to talk about now, and plan your time. Knowing yourself and your work habits, we're going to talk a whole bunch this afternoon about knowing yourself. We're going to get a little inward and help you understand like why you're not publishing as much as you should. And remember, it takes a lot of drafts to do this. And finally, share your work early and often. So one of the issues, a lot of times, if you're a perfectionist, you often hold on to it too long before you get feedback from other people. And that leads to a lot of wasted time and energy. Again, I'm going to talk more about co-authorship in a second, or today, but managing your co-authors is hard. Because sometimes they're just like way over here and you're over here. And how do you effectively ignore them without offending them is often a challenge. Typically, when you go to submit, you're going to need these things: a cover letter, an author list, their affiliations and contact information, keywords, the abstract, manuscript text. Often those things have to be separated, although nowadays those get separated for you a bit more effectively in many journals. Figures, the financial disclosures, and a copyright agreement. So the cover letter is a brief statement to the editor. And when I say brief statement, I mean like 1 to 2 to 3 sentences. People tend to rewrite their whole paper in the cover letter, trying to convince the editor that it's worthy. Don't bother to do that. I actually barely read them. Some people read them in much more depth. I've said this in a conference with another editor sitting right next to me, and the other editor is like, I read every word. And I'm like, I don't really read them. So you don't know for sure, but if you can't tell me why I should be publishing your paper in 1 to 2 sentences, then you haven't really distilled the message down. You will often be asked to identify 3 to 4 competent reviewers. So obviously those people should not be people from your own institution. They shouldn't be the people that trained you. They should be like independent people. Sometimes you have no idea who they should be. Well, in those cases, look up from your reference list, like who's there, do a little Googling. You can find reasonable people. Most of the time, I would say editors will take 1 or 2 people from that list. They won't take all of the reviewers from that competent reviewer list. In general, in your cover letter, don't try to say, don't ask Bill to be a reviewer. What do you think I do when someone says that? I ask them. Why do I do that? Well, there's a reason why you're trying to exclude them. Usually it's some scientific disagreement. I do it intentionally knowing that I won't weight that necessarily the same as everybody else, and I'll probably add them as an extra as opposed to like commonly we only get 2 reviewers. I would add them as a third. I would then like know that they were the potential problem, and I would see what they have to say. And then if what they say makes sense, but the other 2 are like, this is the greatest paper ever, and this one is reject, I'll probably not reject it. But what I will do is ask them to write a commentary, an editorial, and then I'll ask you to write an editorial that counters theirs. So we get a little dialogue going of, we think it should be done this way, and we think it should be done this way, but we get the last word as the author.
Regarding the, is that generally a good idea to suggest a review who you know that your article actually not quite aligned with this review's prior publication?
So I would not necessarily list someone. I would, if someone has, if someone has published before and I've now done something that sort of counteracts what they did, I wouldn't list them most of the time. They may get asked anyway because the editor is probably going to figure out, oh, they've published a lot on this topic. That's fine. So you don't want to say something in your discussion, like I said before, that this is a dumb way to do it, but they were ignorant before. Just be aware that your author, the reviewer list comes from that pool of people, so you have to judge it. But I wouldn't list them personally as one to review. I would list someone, I would be more strategic and list someone that likes me instead of someone that's not going to like me.
I have a question about the competent reviewer. So it seems like a tall order to, like, with the expert in the field, it's like, can you review my little paper that has this, especially if it's a brief report. So I would love to know, like, on the receiving end, if somebody asks you to review something, are they actually going to review it? Are they going to pass you off? How does that land?
So if you ask like a big shot in your field, roughly, I'm extrapolating a little bit. So if you list a big shot, I may or may not ask that big shot. But one of the things I do sometimes is I will send it to them saying, I know you're probably not going to review this. Can you recommend 2 or 3 people to do it? And remarkably, sometimes they review it. It really depends on how much that paper grabs them and how much else they have going on at the time. So I wouldn't, as long as you think that person is going to be fair, I wouldn't not list them. I think it's fine. But if you also know, oh, this person was their mentee and now they're established on their own, you might list that person instead because that's someone that's more likely to agree.
So we are looking at hierarchy.
Yeah, we are looking at hierarchy.
And for the not review, so one of the journals specifically asked for who you want to exclude from your review. That seems like they're baiting you.
They are baiting you.
Okay.
Although they may not do what I do. It's possible that they actually follow through and don't ask. But my guess is that they probably look at that and make a decision as to whether or not they feel like they should. Sometimes the cover letter has specific language that you have to include. Just be sure you put that in. The keywords, almost always you have to list a few keywords. Try to figure out what those are. The more they align with mesh headings and Medline, the better off you are. So choose your words carefully and keep in mind that that's how people find your work, right? Like when you go into PubMed to do your search or Google Scholar, you use words reflecting the work. So you want to make sure that what you list aligns with that. Follow the rules for the abstract, whether that be structured or not. The word count, like don't send me an abstract that has 400 words when our word limit is 300. And if the structure of the abstract is not structured, just write it as a structured one, and then before you submit it, take out those words, and that'll work fine.
How nitpicky are the word count limits? It's 300 versus 310 acceptable? Or?
For an abstract, it's pretty strict. For a paper, if the word limit is like 3,500 and you send me 3,550, I'm probably not going to quibble. I may tell you in the response to cut something, but I'm probably not going to say cut it before I look at it. In fact, I've never done that. So, all right, this is archaic, but double-spaced text for a manuscript is still reasonable. The reason for that is people used to, well, when I started, I got them in the mail, and they were all double-spaced, hard copy. You wrote comments in between the lines. Generally follow the formatting requirements. And the last point is really important. Include line numbers. Ideally from, it can be, each page can be line number. That's fine. But it gives the reviewer something to tell you back that there was a typo on line 65. Yeah, even if they don't specifically require it. I just said that. The figures, as we mentioned, include complete figure legends. Avoid wasting space. Generally don't want bar graphs. Journals don't love bar graphs because it's like a big chunk of blank, empty space for not much more information than 3 percentages that you could have told me in the text. Never ever use the Excel default 3-dimensional pie chart, ever, for anything. No one can interpret it. No one can really read it. Just make it 2-dimensional, and then you can, all of a sudden, you can see what the pie chart actually looks like. Make the figures pretty. Excel defaults are not pretty. And then if you have the money and they're going to charge you more for color, go ahead and use color, because color figures are much easier to look at than grayscale ones generally. But some journals will charge quite a bit for that, so make sure you know how much they're going to charge before then. All right, moving on to the journal structure. So typically a journal will have one editor-in-chief. Sometimes there's 2 or 3 that sort of share the position. Then there will be something like an associate editor, or editors really, or deputy editors is another term. And then on the other side here we have the managing editor. That person is not necessarily an academic. That's someone who is, sometimes they have actual editing skills in terms of like reading things and fixing it. More commonly, they're just the manager, like they're making sure that all the boxes are checked. Below the associate editors are an editorial board, and then you have the reviewers for the journal. So when a manuscript comes in, the managing editor will look at it first. They're the one that sort of triages it in terms of does it meet the requirements of the journal. Now sometimes, increasingly, and this is a good thing, there's less triage for just formatting issues. Like if you send me a paper that's in the format of, JAMA, and we have a slightly different format, historically that would get sent back to you right away. Increasingly that doesn't happen as much, and that's a good thing for us as authors. Then it will come to the editor-in-chief to look at. The editor-in-chief can make a decision to reject it outright. For a journal like, say, JAMA, probably 90% are rejected that way. You'll hear the term desk reject sometimes. That's a desk reject. That means it never made it off the editor's desk. Then it will, if the editor-in-chief is like, this looks like it's good enough to at least get reviewed, it goes to an associate editor who usually has some substantive expertise. So like for our journal at STD, we have people that are sort of more in the HIV space and some people that are more in particular organisms and others in different organism spaces. Then the associate editor can look at it and say, this isn't going to make it, and send it back and say, I'm not going to send it out. That's a desk reject as well. Every once in a while, it'll come back to the editor-in-chief and they'll say, no, 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 you have to send it out. I think it's really important. That doesn't happen maybe 1 in at least 500 times. Not very often, but it can happen. Once the associate editor decides they like it, they send it out to the reviewers. Those reviewers may be part of the editorial board or not. That's a journal specific thing. So for the journal STD, almost every paper is reviewed by one editorial board member. We have a large editorial board, and so we use them heavily. And part of the like perk, great perk, of being on the editorial board is you get to review lots of papers. And then the peer reviewers will make their recommendation and send it back to the associate editor, really, who will then make a recommendation to the editor-in-chief. So peer review is a little like this gauntlet here. You get beat up along the way, but hopefully you make it to the end. So once the reviews come back, the associate editor will look at it. They will make a determination between like accept, revise, and resubmit, and reject. And then the editor-in-chief will look at that, decide if they agree, and make a decision. So ultimately, it's the editor-in-chief making that final decision of accept, revise, and resubmit, or reject. I would say for our journal, probably 10% of the time, I'll shift it up or down one direction from what's being recommended for one reason or another. Sometimes it'll be like we have 2 or 3 reviews. One of them is reject, but when you read that reject, it's not that bad. So it becomes a revise and resubmit. Or we have a category that I like a lot, which is actually revise and re-review, which tells the author right up front that it's going to go back out to the reviewers. Not all journals have that. So then it comes back to you. You do your magic. You send it back in. Comes back to the editor-in-chief. Most of the time, that's all that's going to happen. The editor-in-chief is going to say, cool, we're going to go with it, unless it's a journal like JAMA. Does anyone know how it works at JAMA? So at JAMA, the associate editor that the paper has been assigned to handles the whole thing. Like the editor-in-chief doesn't do very much on an individual paper. And when it comes back after something like this, they have every week they have a big conference, big meeting where each associate editor goes to battle for the papers that they want to accept. And so you might have made it all the way through and everything looks rosy and you still get rejected by JAMA because your associate editor wasn't able to convince the other associate editors that your paper was worthy of being included. Which is frustrating on the author side because everything's looking rosy and then all of a sudden it's rejected and they're like, let's put it in JAMA Network instead of JAMA. Anyway, most of the time when it comes back, the decision will be made then. Sometimes it will go back out to the reviewers. You have no idea of knowing if it's going to go back out to the reviewers unless they were pretty explicit that it would. And then you go through that whole process again. So I'm pretty sure none of you has had a paper accepted without revisions. Oh, you did?
Yeah, my first one, which is kind of crazy.
Yeah.
Never had one since, but my first one.
And both reviewers like, wow, here you go. So I have so one of my colleagues years ago who wrote her first paper and got the revise and resubmit letter back, and it said, you know, we cannot publish this paper in its current form. You know how negative they are? Well, she thought it was rejected. She like submitted it to another journal because it was so like unpleasant. But when it's clear that it's actually a revise and resubmit, it will be accepted almost always, but not always. So many of you have reviewed, I'm pretty sure. Keep in mind that reviews always have two parts. One part is something that only the editor sees, and the reviewers have put comments there, and those comments can either be like really helpful to you or incredibly hurtful to you. And when they're hurtful, it means that they're saying something like, essentially, this paper is terrible. And then down here, they're saying, this paper was well written, blah, blah, blah. And they'll still list problems down there, but they will be much nicer to you than they are to the editor in terms of what they say about you. That's not the way it's really supposed to be used. The way it's really supposed to be used is for things like, I'm not a biostatistician. This was really complicated. I have no idea if what they did was right. You need a biostatistician to review this in addition to me. That's the kind of thing to say. Another thing you can say is, there were a lot of problems, but this paper was really good. The science was really good. I would like to see it again. And that implies that it'll come back around in a second review. And sometimes you just will say something like, it's an important paper, but the writing is really difficult. So someone needs to do a good job of editing. The way we find reviewers is essentially every journal has a database of reviewers. So once you're an author, you're in that database. Once you've reviewed, you're in that database. Ideally, the expertise is documented. Ideally, if you were an author and they ask you about being in that database, you have a chance to fill in what your expertise is. Some journals actually grade reviewers, and at the end of the year, you might get a letter that said you were in the top 10% of reviews for this particular journal. That's only the like JAMA and that kind of journal. Other places editors find reviewers are from authors of papers previously published in the journal and from the reference list for a manuscript under consideration. That's usually my first place that I go, is the references of the paper you've submitted to me. So for the journal Epidemiology, I'm an associate editor. I'm a like STD, HIV kind of guy, but there I have to do all of infectious diseases. I don't know anything about rotavirus. How am I going to find the reviewers? So I go to the reference list, I start there. I try and find the papers that seem most important, and then I look at the senior and the first authors. Then I go to Google and find out if that first author was like a PhD student, if they're still a PhD student, or if they've moved on. Like, it's a lot of work to find those people. And then sometimes I just give up and do a PubMed search on the whole topic. So these are the places that people are going to be looking. So you can do the same thing, anticipating who might be. And people are busy. They aren't going to go like 10 pages down in PubMed. They're going to go the first page or two. All right. When the review comes back to you, you send it off, comes back. Put your armor on, because you aren't going to be happy, even if it's a positive one, unless it's your first paper and you don't have any critique whatsoever. Be prepared for harsh and unkind words. Sometimes people are just mean for no good reason. Like, it happens. As an editor, the only time I edit a reviewer's response is when they've been mean. And because they can say the same thing without being mean. Keep in mind that it's not about you, it's about the science. So the purpose is to improve the quality of the science and its communication. Then generally try to revise quickly, and remember that your responses are written for the editor as well as the reviewer, because you don't know if it's going to go back to that reviewer. Be conciliatory in your tone. Every time the reviewer says something, they're right, at least to some extent, even if what they said is incorrect about what you wrote. That just means you didn't write it, well, one interpretation, I should say. One interpretation of that is you weren't clear enough in the way you wrote it for them to grab it. So there's still something for you to fix, even though you don't really fix like what was done. And generally, begin with a brief thank you for the reviews, like in the front paragraph. But please don't say, we agree, or thank you for every single comment. Please. A, that's incredibly boring. B, that's a lot of extra words you're asking somebody to read. And you would rather that they spent the time reading words that matter than saying, thank you for this important comment. Thank you for this important comment. Thank you for this great comment, etc. All right, when you respond to the reviews, do everything that is easy and moderate, even when you disagree, unless it's going to make the paper worse. Rarely does something that's easy going to make the paper worse. Now, if they tell you to put in a limitation section when I had you not, that's when I would resist. But other than that, generally don't. Then, if there are hard changes that they're suggesting that you can do, and you think it will really make the paper better, do them. Those first two things give you the ammunition to resist the hard ones that you really don't want to do. And reasons why you really don't want to do them are often like they've asked you to redo the entire analysis. They've asked you to rewrite like the entire discussion section. You don't want to do those things. That's time consuming and not really going to help very much. You can resist those hard things, but because you have the leverage from the first two, and essentially you make a clear argument why you don't want to make that change. And then often, especially when it's a methodsy thing that they want you to do, you can add a limitation description in the discussion that says, I didn't do this. This could be considered a problem or not. This is why we didn't do it that way. Maybe someone else in the future would do it that way. And you've addressed that comment, but without actually doing the hard part. All right, so one more time about responding to reviewers. The tone and the responsiveness are really critical. So you are being thankful for these things. You're just not saying, thank you every time. And you're not rebutting everything. A rebuttal is the one way to turn that almost accepted paper into a rejection. The thing that, I think this is the one thing that makes editors more irritated than anything else, is when people rebut every single thing, or 90% of them. It's like, no, you're wrong, blah, blah, blah. No, we're right, blah, blah, blah. No, you're really wrong on this one, blah, blah, blah. No, that's not what peer review is about. Like, the peer reviewer is trying to make your paper better, accept their feedback, go for it. That response is not a debate. Show that you made substantive changes. So this is what yeah.
I have a question. Would you recommend responding to each of the comments in a separate paragraph or kind of?
I'm going to show you in just a second.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yep. All right. So after you read that initial decision, wait before you read the reviews. That's a simple thing. maybe that's just me, but I think a lot of people, when you get that, oh, they're telling me about this, whether they're positive or negative, your emotions go from like your normal ones to up here somewhere. So I don't look at the reviews for a couple of days because I know they're going to irritate me. I know for sure they're going to irritate. Whether I got rejected or accepted, the reviews are going to irritate me. It's like looking at feedback from a class. Like something in there is going to irritate me. So I just put it aside till I'm chill, and then I look at it. Once you're cool, then read them, and then give yourself a day to digest. Like wander around, let them ruminate, and then you know the big ones, like it's like a filter. The big ones are going to filter to the bottom, and you're going to have a sense of what really needs to be paid attention to. And finally, once you sit down to write, just remember it's about the science and it's not a personal critique. And if you can keep the focus on the science and away from you, it will be a lot easier to respond. So how do you structure the response? Well, the first thing is you copy it word for word in the same order as the review. So reviewer 1, reviewer 2, reviewer 3. It's different in a grant. That's a whole nother talk. In a grant, you mix and match and bring them together. In a paper, it's just in the same order. Then draft a response that highlights the changes that you've made, and and those changes should be described word for word if it's really short. If it's longer, like we change this whole paragraph, don't cut and paste the paragraph, just point to where that paragraph was made. And then eventually you'll have to shorten the whole thing, probably, like you'll have written too much. So here are a couple examples. So this is an introduction. We appreciate the opportunity to revise our manuscript for consideration in the Lancet. We've responded to every comment. Our original manuscript was over the word limit. They still reviewed it. We've substantially reduced it to 49,997. This was a clinical trial. Their limit is 4,500 words. To shorten the manuscript, we've added 3 appendices. But basically we're saying we couldn't shorten it as far as we needed. You can tell it's a British journal because they're using S's for where it should be a Z, that sort of thing. So the critique is given, then the response is really obvious and clear with like big response and then italics, sometimes bold. I'll show you one where you do it in a different color. These are small changes, so the response is relatively small, and you can see, like I have pointed out, line 101, 102, this is the change, and the actual change is underlined there to make it clear. When you do it with a whole paragraph, you say, so we agree it was confusing as written, we've revised the paragraph, it's there, go see it. This is an example of declining the change. So they've asked us to, trying to remember, oh, they're asking us about some data that we didn't have. Like there's no way we can answer this question, no matter how hard we try. So we're saying, like, we would love to be able to do this, but we can't because we don't do that. And in this case, there's some other issues that we can describe in depth. When you get to reviewers 2 and 3, reviewer 1 might have said, make this change. You don't have to repeat the whole thing, just point them back to reviewer 1. Say, there you go, reviewer 2, point number 2 above. This is just to show that color can work nicely. I really like, actually, color responses when I'm the editor, because honestly, when I'm reviewing, I don't spend that much time re-looking at what the comment was. I spend the time looking to see what you did instead. I sort of skim this part and read this part. Sometimes you'll see people do it like this, where they have the comment on one side and the response on the other. I find this a little irritating, actually. Like it's fine, it's correct. There's nothing wrong with it other than my brain works better this way than like this way and then this way. Like I can do it better just sort of linearly down, and it leaves tons of white space in the thing, so it makes for a really long response to digest. So I would prefer you don't do it. If this is your thing and your mentor has taught you to do it this way, I had a mentor that did it this way. I did it for a couple and then I abandoned ship. Go ahead and do it, but it's a little irritating for me. All right, so you got a rejection. What do you do? Well, most of the time you just move on to the next journal. Most of the time. Every once in a while in your career, you can challenge that rejection. That can occur at the desk review stage, or it can occur at the after review stage. If it happens at the desk review stage, it means that you have to send back a thing that, like an email to the editor saying this was desk rejected. I really think this is a great journal for this because of these reasons. Now, if you happen to have a big shot co-author with you that might be recognized by the editor, have the big shot co-author do that email. One of the few times I've done this, I can't even say I did it because it wasn't me. My PhD student had written a great paper, went to the Lancet, desk rejected. My boss, famous person, wrote to the Lancet editor. He was a co-author as well. It got reviewed, got accepted in the end. That wouldn't have happened if I had been the one emailing at that stage in my career, probably. That's unfair, but it's kind of the way the world works. Now, later in the game, if it's after a review, anyone can do that. Like it's only because it was desk rejected that you needed that extra influence, I would say. Later in the review, in the process, anyone can do it. So if you get a paper back and you read the reviews, and despite having done what I said and cooling off before reviewing them, you're like fuming afterwards because they completely missed the point. Especially like reviewer 2 got it completely wrong, and reviewer 1 was loving this paper, and then it's rejected, and you look at it and you like, this person either didn't read it well or was biased or whatever. You can write back and say, I think there was a problem with review 2. Could you get another review? And I'm happy to accept whatever your decision is, whether you allow that additional review or not. And just be nice and be concise, and I would say 95% of the time I will send that back out for review. Doesn't happen that much. But I also know people that challenge like a lot of them. I don't send all of those out because like that's becoming equivalent to being the rebuttal in every response kind of thing.
I had a paper that the reviewer 1 feedback was moderately manageable, and the reviewer 2, the editor kept saying they can't find someone, and so then they rejected it. Have you had that?
They rejected it just because they only had one review?
I don't know if that's worth, I mean, it's...
No, that's a thing for sure. The hard time finding reviewer 2 is a thing. And I know why it was rejected. All right, so here you go. Especially from COVID forward, it has become really difficult to get reviewers. Probably a good 50 to 75% harder than it used to be. Most of the time when that happens to me, as like the editor reviewing it, I look very carefully at that one review, and if it would be accepted based on that review, I'll go ahead and do a revise and resubmit, even though I just have one review. And I've, like for epidemiology, I've conferred with the editor-in-chief, and he agrees with that process. And at STD, we'll do similarly. The second thing that can happen is every now and then the associate editor will assign themselves as a reviewer and do a second review. Now, what happened in your case was probably that they decided that because they couldn't find a reviewer, it wasn't a good fit for the journal. And they're basically saying, well, from our readership, I've asked, 10 people, no one wants to do it. It must not be a good fit, even though that's not really necessarily a logical step.
Okay, so
Just move it on, and it doesn't bode well for the journal in general when they can't find reviewers. But it is much harder than it used to be. Any other comments? I think I hit the button while I was here. Okay. All right. So once your paper is accepted, it may or may not have professional editing. A lot of times it won't. Most of the smaller journals don't have a professional editor. You will receive galley proofs with the changes. Make sure, no matter what the journal, make sure that you look at those carefully. I once had figure 1 and figure 2 transposed, so the figure legends were off. So figure 1 legend was actually for figure 2. So look carefully, make sure you find all the things, and actually if more than one author looks at it is a good thing. Remember that the whole purpose is to improve the quality and just make sure the science is good. It also helps to advance knowledge. So when you're a reviewer, keep in mind that part of your responsibility to the profession is to be a reviewer. So if you submit a paper to a journal and it gets reviewed, a reasonable rule of thumb is you owe that journal 2 reviews, because you've gotten 2 reviews in response. That doesn't mean that if you're super busy and they ask you, you can't say no. That's fine. We'll talk about that in a second. It is time-consuming, and generally speaking, early career investigators do a better job than old people. It's just true. So one thing to note, that peer review is based on an old sort of archaic system. In a way, it's a privileged system, and it was developed largely for other people of privilege, and therefore sexism, racism, nationalism, I can't pronounce that word, but it means the killing, silencing, annihilation, or devaluing of a knowledge system enter the process too often. So it's hard for people of color to publish. It's hard for people of color to become editors, that sort of thing. And it's really easy for some old white dude to be critical and have that be taken as gospel, so to speak. So bad reviews end up silencing ideas and leading to work that's really important not being accepted. So one way to think about this is to think about it, review as actually a form of mentorship, where your role is to help the person that's the author and help them write better. And that tends to encourage a much more collegial and collaborative kind of review process. That doesn't mean that there's not rejection. It just means that the rejection is done in a kinder and gentler and supportive way. Because sometimes rejection is warranted and sometimes it's not, scientifically. Every review is a crucial historical event that offers a renewed opportunity to disrupt and democratize the existing canon. That just means we all have the opportunity to be good citizens and be responsible and allies for other scholars. And again, being an ally sometimes means saying your work was not good for these reasons. So be kind and constructive. So to be a good reviewer means to review papers you're qualified to review. You can ask the editor if you don't think you're qualified. Sometimes I have a very explicit reason for asking you. Like you're a nephrologist and you know acute glomerulonephritis really well, but you don't know these fancy methods. I can say to you, I want you to review the substance. I don't care about what you know about the methods. You can, if you have a conflict, tell the editor and they'll tell you whether they care or not about that particular conflict. Respond quickly, and I can't emphasize this enough. It's way better to say no right away than to leave it in your inbox. Because a big part of the delay in reviews is that initial period where someone doesn't respond. So do not fail to indicate whether you will review or not. Fail to complete a review after agreeing to do it. Both of those are really painful, really painful. And finally, provide a thoughtful and considerate review. So a way to do a good review the paper once when you receive it, jot a few notes down, let it ruminate. I like to walk around and think about it, usually for at least a day, and then I read it again, and then I start doing the review in earnest. And sometimes if it's a really important paper, I'll give it a third read. But I almost never do it on just one read through. It should be objective, a thorough, really focusing on the science and considering the big picture. What does this add? A lot of times it's a Me Too kind of paper, right? Like people have done it before. If it's that kind of paper, is that confirmation important or not? Is there a fatal flaw? If there's a fatal flaw, put that right up front in your review. And if it's a truly fatal flaw, don't spend a whole lot of time with the rest of the review because they aren't ever going to overcome that fatal flaw. Did they convey the information clearly and talk about the things you know, not the things that you don't feel qualified for? In general, be kind, especially in the beginning. Like, give something kind up front. Just don't say it's well written when it wasn't well written, or it's a great paper when it's not a great paper. Find something to say that is truthful and positive. That's why I said, don't say it's well written when it's not, or it's important when it's not, or it's interesting when it's not, because that puts the editor in a bind when they're rejecting something because the authors come back and say, look, the reviewers thought it was the greatest thing ever, and you're like, but they not really. Number your comments, just like I want you to number your lines in your text. Use small explicit statements. One of the problems with old reviewers is they write these big long paragraphs that are impossible to decipher. Provide solutions rather than just pointing out the problems. And group major and minor comments. So you have major and then minor. Organize by most important first, organize by most important or just by section, like introduction, methods, review. You can choose which way you prefer. Again, be kind and constructive and phrase the comments like you would like to receive them. If you use that mantra all the time, you'll do good reviews. Be sure to touch on the importance of the study question, the rigor of the scientific method, the appropriateness of the approach and methods, its contribution to the literature, the appropriateness of the interpretation and conclusion, how well it communicated, this is like that one is often done right up front. And just make sure all of those elements are in there and you'll have a good review. So once you consider the reviews, the editors are going to think about, does this fit our journal or not? That'll be based on these kinds of things like, is it original or is it not? How appropriate was it? Is it a valid thing? The quality of the writing. When we're thinking about the letter that goes out to you for revise and resubmit, one of the things we'll think about is there anything else that has to be done besides what the reviewer said that needs to make this publishable? Is the paper too long? Should it become a brief report? And almost always we think things are too long because we have a certain number of pages to publish every year, and if we let everybody be long, we can't publish as many papers. Other things we think about is, should there be an editorial? And is it a supportive one or a counterpoint? Then should there be a press release or a tweet? And even though people don't really look at paper journals anymore, a fair amount of time is still spent figuring out what the order of the papers are in the journal. I just did that this week. And these things about editorials, that's sometimes a reason to publish in a specialty journal. So to become a reviewer, mostly it really depends on just being asked by the journal based on having published. That's probably the most common way, or having published elsewhere. But sometimes you can sort of raise your hand and say, look, I know you're the most important journal in my field. I would love to review for you. That does make a difference. I just sent out a name to my associate editors just recently. So think about how to be a good reviewer, how to respond well to the reviews, and that'll make your publishing life much, much easier. So thanks very much. Any questions on this part?
Is that generally a very bad thing to respond to the reviews like late, almost like that deadline?
Oh, if you no. So there's, if you're the author and you're responding to the reviews, it doesn't matter when, really. Like, even if you're late, just ask for an extension. I would much rather get it and have it have been thoughtful than have it be rushed.
Yeah, sometimes it can be months when you're in clinical rotation.
Yeah, exactly.
It's hard to push them too.
Yeah, so sometimes it can be really hard to find the time to do it. Just send an email to the editorial team saying that you need an extension, and they'll say fine. Now, on the other flip side, if you're the reviewer, do your absolute best to meet that deadline, because you're holding up the whole process when you go long. So for STD, we now have a 2-week deadline, and what that does for turnaround for reviews, and what that does for us is it gets our reviews by 3 weeks. Because when we used to have a 3-week deadline, it used to take us a month. So we shortened it to 2 weeks, and we gained a week by tricking the reviewers into thinking that they were going to do it earlier. And it worked. There was another question back here.
Yeah, I have heard people in the cover letter to like note the publications from previous years that are current paper that we're submitting on sites or is relevant to. Would you recommend doing that in the cover letter also? It wasn't in the...
Yeah, so like, you mean like they are highlighting a paper that was published in that journal before?
Yep, in cover letter.
There's no harm in doing that. That seems like a lot of extra work, and I doubt that very many editors pay that much attention.
Okay.
A lot of these things are not studied, right? So I'm telling you what I think, but as I mentioned, like another editor might want that information. So again, I can't see any harm in doing something like that, but it does seem like a lot of extra work for something that someone's going to glance at.